Hey everyone, welcome to the AI Canvas, the podcast that explores the impact of generative AI on businesses, the arts, and our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Foster, co-founder of Applied Data Science Partners and author of the book Generative Deep Learning, Teaching Machines to Paint, Write, Compose, and Play. Now, over the coming weeks, we'll be diving deep into fascinating conversations with a diverse range of thought leaders, including musicians, artists, journalists, educators, marketers, lawyers, and those at the cutting edge of this fascinating field. We'll explore their unique insights into the opportunities and potential threats of deploying this technology across industries and how it's going to reshape our world. We have a fascinating conversation ahead of us, so sit back, relax, and let's dive into the world of generative AI right here on the AI Canvas. So, welcome back to the AI Canvas podcast. I'm your host, David Foster, and I'm totally delighted today to be joined by one of my friends and colleagues, Henry Ajder. Henry is a leading expert in generative AI and synthetic media, known for shaping public understanding of deepfakes. He has advised major organizations like Meta, the European Commission, House of Lords, you name it, as well as conducting pioneering research at MIT and Witness. Frequent media contributor and BBC presenter, Henry has spoken at top venues such as South by Southwest and Oxford University, and he's also been recognised as a leading European figure in generative AI by Sifted. So today we are going to be diving into just about everything to do with generative AI you could possibly think about to gauge his thoughts, because he's seen a huge amount, talking to loads of really interesting people. And so today we can dive into some of those topics with Henry. And Henry, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, David. Looking forward to mapping some interesting emerging trends that we've been seeing over the last 6 years or so, I guess, with deepfakes, synthetic media, and generative technologies.
Yeah, because you got into this early, right? This is not just your thing after the ChatGPT hype. You were in this well before that.
I was. I'm a bit of a Gen AI hipster in that sense. You know, I was there in the small back bar kind of room. So since, really, as you mentioned, deepfakes is where I really entered into this space. And I think one of the really interesting things we've seen over the last 18 months or so is this very kind of quite clever rebrand of kind of essentially what we've been describing as deepfakes for quite some time into, in many cases, generative AI, right? But really, we're talking about some very similar baseline technologies. But yes, I came across deepfakes in 2017, late 2017 on Reddit, off of the Futurism forum that had pointed to the original subreddit deepfakes where the term was coined. Sorry. This was obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but this was originally in the context of non-consensual pornography targeting women. But beyond the horror of that use case, I really had a bit of a eureka moment about this technology is truly going to change everything. My background's in philosophy of perception, so I was already thinking a lot about the ways that we see the world and how media was changing that, and in particular how AI was changing that. And so since then, I've kind of done what I would refer to as kind of deepfake or Gen AI cartography. This space is moving so fast. Sometimes it feels like doing cartography in a sandstorm, right? The landscape is constantly shifting. But that's precisely why I, over the years, have done research mapping specific use cases, emerging, technologies that are being kind of experimented with, as well as looking at kind of threats and opportunities more broadly, who's being affected, and ultimately just trying to provide tangible data, which is beyond speculation, which is beyond hype, that kind of helps people understand what's actually going on, and then giving them the kind of ammunition, I guess, if they're lawmakers or activists, to try and get change to occur in a positive way, or if they're businesses, to utilize these tools responsibly, or if you're indeed a government, to try and legislate effectively to encourage responsible use and mitigate harmful ones.
Super interesting. I mean, it must have been such a whirlwind for you seeing this technology come slowly and then all of a sudden, all at once. Because I think, for those of us who've been around this a while, it used to follow the traditional patterns of tech adoption. There were some early adopters, and the tech evolved sort of gradually, didn't it, up until a point. And then I don't know where you would put the point at which everything started to be a bit crazy. But for me, certainly, ChatGPT being released was a big a step towards the public being more aware of this and policymakers being more aware of this. And before that, it was almost seen as a bit of a sort of yeah, sure, deepfakes are a thing, but are they really affecting people's lives? Would you say has that changed now, and you think policymakers are almost scared of this technology to the point where they need to be seen to be doing something?
Yeah, so there's, I guess, two questions in there, and I'll answer the first one, which is I really feel the start of really seeing this moment, emerging, as you said, this explosion of interest was actually for me with a tool called Wombo Dream, which you
Hmm.
might remember, David, was a tool by a Canadian startup called Wombo. They'd done some kind of meme style lip synchronization tools where you could upload a photo of yourself and it would kind of make your head in this quite absurd, glitchy way sort of sing along to a famous song or something like
Hmm.
this. Um, After that tool, which was quite successful, they released this tool called Wombo Dream, which was kind of about generating these incredibly kind of ethereal, very aesthetically styled images, very similar to kind of early Mid-Journey.
Mm.
And this tool really blew up as well. This was really, really popular, got a huge amount of traction, was one of the best selling or most downloaded apps on the iOS and Android stores for some time. And then after that came DALL-E 2, which was OpenAI's text-to-image generation model. And these only predated ChatGPT by a little bit, but I think what we saw was that explosive adoption
Mm.
because these tools were so accessible, right? And because people could get hands-on with these generative technologies in a way that previously you couldn't really do. Or if you did, it was kind of on rails, right? It would swap your face into one of these 5 scenes, for example.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
didn't give you, the individual, that fine-grained control to type in a prompt and sort of tweak them and essentially have a more of an open book as to how you could use the tool. So obviously ChatGPT, completely different modality with text, and obviously that kind of really took off in a way that perhaps those tools didn't, or at least certainly didn't perhaps have the same impact on the general consciousness. But that for me
Mm.
is really the moment where I saw, oh, okay, this is really taking off now. Um, since 2017, we have seen some use cases, particularly in the entertainment advertising space, where there have been some quite novel examples of impact being generated in, lip synchronization for dubbing or face swapping in films. Ukrainian startup Respeech are even doing entire voice skinning, taking an
Mm.
original actor's performance and skinning it with someone else's, I guess, voice, the sound of their voice. But I think the real revolution we've seen is the democratization. And you're quite right in your question that this has led to not just governments, but businesses and indeed different groups in society kind of panicking and being like, oh God, this is here. And it's not just here, it's absolutely taking off. And it's moving so fast. I'm
Mm.
sure you, David, having been in the space for a long time too, you probably, I imagine as well, weren't expecting it to be quite as fast as it was. I certainly wasn't.
For sure. Mm.
So I think there is a good argument to be made that we need to move quickly to try and do something. At the same time, that's kind of antithetical to the way that government and legislation works. For good reason, on one level, right? We don't want legislators to be rushing laws that could potentially
Mm.
impact entire economies, could impact entire business models, and kind of, steamroller over nuance. At the same time, the longer it takes to get those laws in place, the
Yeah.
more of the Wild West we see emerging. Um, so certainly something that I've been talking to a lot of people about recently is kind of how we get that balance right between effective, timely legislation and then also legislation that does what it needs to do and navigates those quite difficult questions, both
Mm.
ethically and legally.
Do you think, just so digging into that a little bit more, do you think that we almost need new mechanisms to legislate and to pass laws,
Mm.
for want of a better way of putting it, to kind of to give guidance as well, not just laws, but initially guidance and then making that legislative? Because at the moment, I feel certainly that the technology evolves almost to a point. There's almost a threshold beyond which, if it moves faster than this point, there is no mechanism through which our democratic systems can keep up, and that by the point at which that legislation comes in, it's almost too late because the tech will have evolved 3 steps. It's always 3 steps ahead, and that's too
Mm.
much. So, have you sort of faced that in your work at all? Is that something you're discussing?
Certainly. So I've worked with various governments around legislation and advised on legislation and continue to do so. And one of the big challenges is, A, do we need entirely new laws to capture these potential harms or potential use cases, or can we update existing laws? That's a debate that's kind of ongoing in different contexts of how AI is being used. But more to the point, as you said, it's kind of how do we future-proof this, right? How do we actually make sure that we're regulating in a way where the moment that regulation, passes through the House in the UK context, that it isn't essentially, kind of dead on arrival or, redundant essentially from the moment that it actually is put into practice. And there are a couple of ways of approaching that. So, principles-based approaches around AI are quite useful. And for example, when it comes to generative AI, which I guess is the focus of the work that I'm doing and have been doing for some time, it's perhaps talking about, synthetic media as a kind of media rather than focusing on how the tools specifically work, right? Because new architectures are emerging all the time. Everyone's obsessed with diffusion models at the moment or with transformers, but who knows what's going to be coming down the pipeline in 5 years. These might look antiquated by then. So focusing on the kinds of outputs that you're regulating against, I think, is one quite promising approach. So talking about, yes, AI generated synthetic content or synthetic media, it's a nice way to get around, different ways of generating that media. Similarly, kind of trying to think about ethical principles around, for example, transparency, bias, fairness. These are kind of principles and economic, these are principles and ethical principles at that I would like to think, at least, are maybe timeless is too strong, but they're certainly robust principles, right? A kind of a thou shalt not release hyperreal synthetic content without disclosure, kind of vibe, or but bias should be mitigated against to ensure that equal access to tools, is possible, as is equal outputs from tools. But there is that challenge of, well, okay, we need to also balance this with pro-innovation. A lot of businesses, a lot of companies and countries obviously pushing quite hard on that angle of, well, either don't regulate us too hard, otherwise we're going to go somewhere else. And countries obviously trying to welcome investment and talent. So these are really kind of ongoing tensions, right? These are ongoing dilemmas that lawmakers are dealing with. And I think for me, I see firsthand how the Wild West dynamic around some kind of generative use cases is causing harm and is causing problems. But I think the greater good, for me at least, is to be achieved if we do make sure that legislation we pass now via the UK's equivalent of the EU AI Act, or indeed the EU AI Act, or the US's, almost certain forthcoming legislation, is as future-proofed as possible, and it is built on those principles which kind of capture they more capture the phenomena of AI than the instance, so to speak. And I think that for me is critical, is that we're not going after the individual instance. We're going after the principles and the kind of framework of thinking about it.
It's a great point, I think, because like you say, if you start trying to legislate the actual technology that we have today, then that will become out of date. But if you talk about the principle that you're trying to avoid or the scenario that you're trying to legislate against, then you have a much better chance of that standing the test of time. Do you think there's a problem, or at least this is made more difficult by the fact that this is quite a technologically complex issue to grasp for policymakers or for senior leaders in businesses, to understand what is AI and how is it different from the AI that we had 3 years ago or 4 years ago, which actually was very, very different, really. I mean, the idea of a foundational model, something that you can just take off the shelf and start using, wasn't really a thing for businesses. They had to capture lots of data, and there was a huge training process that went into any model that you wanted to build. It was very narrow, it can generalize. But now it's very different. And I think undoing some of that knowledge must be quite difficult, I think, for policymakers, but also for senior business leaders. And do you find that the education is part of what you have to do as somebody going around speaking to these people, is to kind of describe at a base level what we're talking about here in the first instance?
This is a really good question, and indeed, I mean, I'm quite happy to educate, right? Like, I actually quite enjoy going into a room with people from different I say walks of life or different business contexts, different legislative positions, civil servants, MPs, members of the House of Lords, for example, and trying to help them get up to speed on this stuff and doing some myth busting and cutting through that hype. I mean, I know, David, you're all too familiar with it as well, but obviously this space has become incredibly noisy. I remember a time when I could spend a couple of hours a day, maybe if that, going through the news around generative technologies, deep fakes or use cases, new models being released, new papers being presented. And I'd feel pretty on top of everything. Whereas now, not anyone who says they're on top of everything going on is lying. It's just not possible. With the speed of the change that we're seeing, it's hard for even someone such as myself who does this for a living, who has been doing this for 6 years, to keep up. People who are running entire media teams in news organizations, they've got a lot of other stuff on their plate, and time is precious to them, right? So you can't give them the whole 101, the whole kind of historical arc. And it's about the kind of art of I guess, keeping people's attention and getting through to the points that they need to hear specifically. So in the case of a regulator or a politician, that might be about, helping them understand how this is actually a risk to them individually, right? Something I always used to get the attention of people working in the political sphere is, well, okay, if you don't regulate this properly, the chances of you getting targeted by a deepfake that could potentially endanger your career is higher. And in the media context, it might be, well, look, replacing journalists with LLMs sounds great, but did you see what happened to CNET and their newsletter on finance, right? So it's about making it relevant to them, grounding it in their world. And then, as you said, talking about that transition from more, I guess traditional is the wrong word, but certainly older versions of AI to this more generative format. But it's a challenge. It is a challenge, and there are many more people that need to have those briefings, that need to have those kind of demystifying sessions than I can really reach, or that perhaps even know they need it. So I'm fortunate that I've engaged with a lot of really engaged MPs and people in these spaces who are doing some really good work and are really pushing forward hard. But there's no sugarcoating the fact that there are lots of people who have heard about generative AI. They maybe thought, oh, okay, Alexa, that was something AI-like, right?
Exactly.
Or, my Spotify next track recommended, that's AI. But they hadn't really thought about what AI could be in terms of quite a visceral, almost intimate co-pilot to how you create things. And so now there's a lot of kind of rush, again, to regulate, but also to deploy. And again, David, I'd love to hear, your kind of thoughts on this as well, right? As someone who helps people deploy both responsibly and in a robust way. There are lots of stories I hear about people doing this and not really understanding the implications of how they're doing it with interesting results, shall we say.
Yeah, exactly. It's part of the reason I asked actually that question is the fact that we often see senior leaders looking to go into the weeds of which model to choose, or how to deploy the solution, or whether it's going to be deployed on their own architecture, or whether it's in the cloud, or whether we use an API or open source, well before they've even thought about the use case and the potential for what this is going to do for their users. And I think the reason why I asked there about the technological complexity of what we're dealing with here is because I feel like the tech should always support the result. It should never be the other way around, that we have to find results to match this technology that we have at the moment. And actually, we can still engage, I think, on a very practical and real, tangible level with senior leaders without having to invoke any sort of technological speak whatsoever, because ultimately these are human problems that we're dealing with. And so, I think that's how I describe what I'm seeing, is that we often have to try to convince people to stay away from worrying too much about which tech to worry about, to begin with, and actually start dealing with, what do you want the output to look like? What do you want this to be able to do? What are the risks? What do you don't want it to be able to do? What would be terrible if this could, this happened, so that we can mitigate against it. So everything you said there resonated so strongly.
And just to add to that, David, I mean, there are two phrases which at least one phrase that's often thrown around in hype cycles, and I think we both agree that there is a hype cycle going on right now with generative AI. It may not be the same type of hype cycle as perhaps we saw around Web3 or metaverse or, NFTs or something like this, but hype nonetheless. And I guess one phrase is often used in hype cycles is solutions looking for problems, right? People building technologies without actually thinking about what they're meant to solve, and then trying to sort of, round peg, square hole it into a use case. But also one which is not my phrase. I heard it the other day. I can't remember where, but I really like it, which is novelty isn't revolution, right? You can build something novel that's interesting, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to change much. I'm of the opinion that there are some really revolutionary use cases of generative AI, but not every use case is revolutionary. And I think at the moment in particular, you're talking there about foundation models, which one to choose. Do you go API open source, cloud, kind of native architecture? And I think there's the place I worry the most about hype with at the moment is actually with LLMs and foundation models. To the point where we're even now seeing, Gen AI and LLM or foundation model being used interchangeably, as if there isn't a whole nother world of other use cases in the audiovisual space, or indeed in the extended reality space and so on. So, for me, there's a real concern that people are rushing to deploy, and I'm not going to name names, but I've seen some pretty. Well, I already did earlier with CNET, but that's the only one I'll use. But there are some really quite good use cases out there, which I always present to people who are looking to deploy, being like, well, okay, this was enhancing a customer chatbot, or was meant to enhance a customer chatbot. It ended up going off on a kind of psychopathic rampage and saying a load of inappropriate things, or this people didn't use it, people didn't care, and that's again, it's like, fine, novelty. Coca-Cola creates, you might have seen Coca-Cola created a new Coke flavor created by AI, and the packaging is designed by AI, and it's like, well, fine, great, that's novelty, that's not revolution. The revolution would be if, maybe they were designing billboards, which were digital billboards, which were changing in real time based on, user prompts being sent in or something like this. And people, maybe that's more interesting. But I think, your work and mine, I'm sure overlaps on trying to steer people away from overexcitement and overestimation of what is currently possible, towards a slightly more grounded perspective of, yes, this technology can change things dramatically for the better. But we need to make sure we know, as you said, what the use case is and how you're actually going to deploy in a way that's not going to cause you more problems than solutions.
I'd be interested to hear if you had to choose 3 words to describe the most likely emotions of people that you're speaking to at the moment around generative AI. What would you say in terms of, their feelings? I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but what 3 words would you describe their sort of their thoughts to be?
One is definitely concern. I was going to say fear, but I'd say concern. I don't think it's quite as visceral as kind of pure fear, but a lot of people who are deeply concerned, who are thinking very deeply about the threat vectors, the capacity of their organizations to perhaps challenge or counter malicious uses, to enforce new legislation, even if it's passed and it's good. How do we actually make it work? So concern, I'd say, is definitely one. Excitement, clearly another, right? I mean, and an excitement, as just detailed, that I think often, strays a little bit too far into kind of blind enthusiasm. But nonetheless, there are reasons to be excited. There's a lot of really cool use cases, as mentioned, particularly in the audiovisual space, in my opinion, that I've seen. So a lot of excitement from, transformation officers, C-suite executives, people who are playing around with this technology, artists, people seeing it being used in, the accessibility space. The way I typically break down generative AI use cases is into commercial, creative, and pro-social, right? So commercial is, the chatbot example I gave earlier, or maybe helping you kind of streamline search through a database, or to retrieve something like that. Creative could obviously be in advertising. It could kind of stray into commercial, but it's people who are using these tools to create new kinds of music, or as a co-pilot in their own sort of creative processes. And then pro-social is the cases where like, that's just great. That's just really good for society. Yeah, exactly. the classic example that I've been citing for years is giving voices to people who've lost the ability to speak that sounds like them. It's amazing. Accessibility is one space I think we're going to see generative AI have massive impact for the better, but also things like, recreating the sounds of songbirds that are going extinct and using them in a way that then kind of helps people understand, how they might have sounded in chorus, for example. So it doesn't always have to be super hard hitting, but yes, so excitement across all those three spaces. And then I guess the final word I would use probably would be a mixture of almost, I guess you could say, bemusement and
sort of disbelief.
kind of, as much as these use cases in some applications are super realistic, hyper realistic, a lot of them still play with the uncanny, right? They're not quite out of the uncanny valley just yet. They're getting there, but they're not quite there. And so there are quite a lot of people who, are just a bit like, oh, this is kind of odd. And they're maybe not thinking about it in terms of, oh, okay, this same tool could be used to clone my voice to scam my parents or to, make me say intimate things to another person other than my partner, right? But I mean, we've seen that, right, with the explosion of memes. I'm sure you've seen some good ones, David. Donald Trump rapping or Joe Biden and Obama playing Monopoly or things like this, right? But these technologies inherently work for the absurd and surreal nature of a lot of online content. So I think that kind of bemusement and sort of, what on earth is this? This is kind of weird. This is kind of fun. This is kind of, so it's nice to have at least some applications where you can just laugh.
Definitely. I think that's a really good set. You mentioned concern there. But you said interestingly that not fear. And I think there is a narrative, isn't there, these days, that AGI is coming and generative AI is just the first step towards this. And I haven't seen this amongst people that I've spoken to, that there's a particular fear amongst the public. I think it's drummed up a lot by media and also by parties who might be interested in creating that sort of environment of fear. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on whether A, you are an AI doomer, and whether you subscribe to that, or whether actually you take a different view. And then B, like, what's your thoughts about how this all might play out and whether we do have something to be fearful about later down the line, but maybe not at the moment.
So when I say concern, I'm talking more about individuals perhaps who are in businesses or, in Whitehall in the UK, in government offices, right? People who perhaps in their professional context aren't really allowed to be fearful. They have to be concerned because they have to be pragmatic, right? And so kind of being terrified and losing your head and running around saying we're all in trouble, to put it politely, isn't necessarily an option for them. I work with other people. I've done a lot of work over the years advocating for better legislation, advise a law commission here in the UK again on updates to the law to protect women from non-consensual deepfake pornography. Again, critical for your audience to know that is still the biggest harm being caused to real people around the world by generative AI is non-consensual deepfake pornography. And there are people who are scared of that and who are fearful, and with good reason. Because I've seen the impact firsthand on victims that I've worked with and survivors. So it's concern perhaps in the more professional context where, essentially emotions aren't allowed to kind of go quite so liberally. I guess, sorry, what was the second part of your question, or the main part of the question before I caveated it, David?
No, that's okay. I guess it'd just be interesting to hear your view on the sort of bigger picture. This is going to be an existential threat to humanity.
Sorry, the AGI.
Exactly. Yeah.
So my background is really on generative AI, right? And I am very careful not to speak to things that I don't believe I have expertise on. And I would definitely not say that I'm an expert on superintelligence or AGI. It's something I've read about. It's something I've worked with people who are working on, and is something that I have an understanding of, but I would not want to be kind of prescribing how people ought to be feeling about this on the whole. From my own perspective, I am naturally worried about this because of what we're seeing with far less sophisticated AI and how that can be used and deployed, right? We've already seen tastes as well, right, of people trying to create auto GPT or autonomous agents, right? And they're really bad right now. They're not something to be worried about necessarily right now, but with my kind of black hat on, thinking about, malicious use cases and the speed of change that we've seen. I mean, Mid-Journey's on version, I think 5 or 6 within a year, and the change in quality is just outrageous. So looking at the kind of clear paths we had without even AGI towards increased harms and automated harm pipelines, so to speak, that does make me worried. And that's within the next 5 years. Now, some people think AGI is going to be in the next 5 years. Again, I'm not an expert. I would imagine that would be very, very unlikely. But still, I think we've got a lot of things to be dealing with right now that mean that, yes, I am concerned about AGI, and I trust that there are great people here in Cambridge at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk and for the Future of Intelligence, same in Oxford at the Future of Humanity Institute, who are thinking about these questions deeply and are working on them. And we do need people working on them and thinking about them. For me, with my world, I'm focused on risks and harms that are happening right now and then short to medium term. So I wouldn't say I'm necessarily an AI doomer insofar as I'm saying, Skynet, which is, I think, how most people think of AGI, right? Which is often annoying. But I'm not thinking, oh God, we've got a decade to solve AGI. I'm thinking, I'm trying to put out fires right now that are burning people today, not in 10 years.
Yeah, that is often the argument that's leveled against the doomer argument, is that there's so much to deal with today that we need to do what's in front of us. Let's get that right first, because actually, if we get that right, that actually solves a lot of problems potentially later down the line. Things like alignment is something that a business needs to care about, as well as potential future AGI that might come. So control as well, who do we give these models to, is a question for today as well as one for the future. So you're right there. I think I would totally agree with that.
Yeah, I think you just put it very, very well, David, that, the principles that I was talking about earlier in legislation, right, are principles that could also plausibly be applied to AGI as well. Maybe not all of the principles, or maybe you would certainly need some more. But I think this is where, we're talking about foundations, right? We're talking about foundation models in the context of LLMs, some multimodal ones, but limited multimodality. But, the idea is, if you're building a foundation model, you want that foundation to be the best it can be on multiple metrics, right? Reliability, least hallucinations possible, least bias presenting in outputs. And I think we have to think about, in a very similar way when we're thinking about AGI. And it's like, well, maybe, as you said, maybe these are the seeds of some kind of AGI. Again, I'm not a computer scientist. I wouldn't want to speculate too much, but it seems like that's something some of the people working in the space certainly think. That makes it even more important that right now we get this right. And so, again, I can understand the argument that the AI doomers are sort of got their head in the clouds a bit, or are worrying about the world being on fire when their house is already on fire. Put that out first and worry about the second bit. At the same time, I do think we do need people. It's not an either or, right? I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think we should have people worrying and thinking deeply about those longer term problems, at the same time that there are folks perhaps closer to me who are trying to mitigate harms and also leverage the amazing opportunities. I don't want to be too down on AI. I really do believe in its value and its potential, and I've seen that firsthand. But there's no sugarcoating again that there's massive consequences if we get it wrong, and I don't think we want a similar situation to what we saw happen with, say, social media, where we didn't regulate and we didn't see what was coming. And now we're left with quite a difficult situation with, how those platforms are affecting our information ecosystems, our politics, and so on.
Yeah, and harms that I think as well that we don't even sometimes know about. It's the unknown unknowns, isn't it? We don't really know how social media is affecting children, and I think the same will be true of AI systems. If we start allowing these systems into society untracked, do we really know what the effect of that is going to be on people's productivity, on their ability to think independently, and so on? So you've made a really good point there. We're coming to the end of our... Oh, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, if I could just be very cheeky, David, and add one example there that I really like when we're talking about, I wrote a piece back in 2019 called, I think, The Emergence of Grey Fakes. Terrible name. But the idea for me was there were loads of ethically ambiguous use cases that fell between those kind of pro-social cases I was talking about earlier, accessibility, healthcare, and so on, and then the explicitly malicious ones, disinformation, non-consensual pornography, cybersecurity and fraud, and things like this. There's a huge swathe in the middle of uses which are really ambiguous. Things like should we be allowing or welcoming kind of hyper realistic virtual influences that are treated as if they're real? You know, and the one that I really have spent time thinking about and worked on is synthetic resurrection, right? This idea of bringing back deceased people using AI. So many questions where we just don't know, for example, how that could impact the bereavement process, recovering from loss. We don't know necessarily how this is going to impact Hollywood, right? If you can keep bringing back deceased actors to keep playing roles in beloved film franchises, I mean, if that had been around for the first Bond, I mean, maybe we'd have only ever had one. So, there's this kind of sense of, a lot of those grey areas where there is still debate and conversation to be had about what we do. And that's the part of my job that I find most interesting, is facilitating and helping to guide those discussions with decision makers to try and help them understand as best as possible how to proceed, and precisely as you said, what kind of like the butterfly effect style consequences may well be of these technologies further down the line.
Yeah. And just looking to the short-term future, what would you say you're most looking forward to hearing about or seeing, or like what would you say in the next 6 months? Let's put a time bound on it. Otherwise, like generative AI these days, like, a year is far too long to even think about. So
Yeah, 6
let's
months
say,
is like 5
before
years
Christmas.
normal time.
Yeah, exactly. What are you thinking? I can't wait to see this happen, or, this announcement that's due. What would you say is on your radar?
So certainly on my radar, and again, both us being in the UK and a lot of my work with the UK at the moment, I'm really interested to see how the UK's AI Safety Summit goes. Something I'm watching very closely. Would love to be involved. We'll see. But I think that is going to be really interesting. That has real potential to kind of be quite an important watershed moment, obviously being hosted at Bletchley Park, home of, the Codebreakers, Turing and so on. I think, it has the potential to kickstart some really meaningful change in a positive way. So from the legislative approach, I'm really hoping that really is a truly global summit. All the players are involved. The kind of some of the geopolitics are left aside, perhaps, and meaningful progress, or at least signals of progress, are made and commitments are made. On the kind of more tech side of things, I think we're going to see some real jumps in synthetic video or generative video. I mean, the likes of Runway just keep pumping out new features, which are just so impressive. So I'm always interested to see video as kind of the next space where I think we've seen already quite significant change. And I imagine before Christmas, we may well do so again, particularly as we're kind of entering publishing kind of territory. So I guess those are the main two. I guess if I'm going to counteract that in terms of, things I'm not so excited about, but more concerned about, I'm really concerned, US 2024 elections, presidential elections. Every year since 2018, for every midterm and presidential election, I've been asked, is this going to be the one where deepfakes cause havoc? And I've always said no. And I still don't know if I'd necessarily say, I still don't know if I'd necessarily say I think they're going to cause havoc, but I do think they're going to be disruptive in a way that they have not been previously. And obviously, the closer we get and the way that the US campaigning starts so early, I imagine we might see some cases added to the ones we've already seen, where politicians are being targeted, and we see people getting fooled in a way that perhaps other forms of more crude, manipulated media would not have done. So those are the kind of three big things for, I guess, January 2024 that are on my radar.
Henry, before we finish up, it's been a fascinating conversation so far. I'm going to finish with probably the trickiest question of the lot, which is around this dilemma between open source and proprietary models, whether this tech should be in the hands of the big Silicon Valley players only, or whether this should be democratized to everybody. Just to end up, let's just end with the trickiest question of them all. What would you say to this? How would you kind of summarize the debate, and what's your thoughts on it?
So this is, I'm really glad you asked this, David. This is such a hot question for me right now. And I think it's the multi-billion-dollar question actually for me right now. Something I've been thinking about, particularly over the last 18 months, is essentially, as you said, the open versus proprietary or closed approach is really changing at the moment. And we've seen, for example, OpenAI, who founded themselves on these kind of principles of openness and the way that they release their code and products. Obviously, they've now become much more closed and much more cautious. They've cited safety as a key reason for that. then flip it on the other way, Facebook, who didn't really open source a huge amount at all, are now really leading the pack with Llama 2, their open source LLM. And we've also seen other players like it was Falcon 40B. I now think they've released a new one, which is 180? 180,
It is,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Which is huge. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so open source, obviously some companies think is the key to kind of really driving adoption and people building on top of their code base essentially. But for me, again, with my safety hat on, I am deeply concerned about open source on one level, because all of the non-consensual pornography and image abuse that we've seen using AI has come from open source. And we're talking both in terms of face swapping, synthetically stripping images of women, voice cloning in intimate context, and indeed more recently in the context of open source image generation models. One in particular, UK-based company, again, won't name them, but you can join dots. Their models, which were really completely open without a huge amount of vetting on the data sets used to train, they're being used to generate, child pornography essentially, and other really inappropriate content. So there's no reason as well why these tools also can't be used to generate, disinformation at scale, that people can't share some pretty unpleasant stuff with that open source model, and essentially weaponize anything that's open source in a way that the creators obviously did not intend, but based on the way they've released it, in some respects you could argue are, and I'm not saying this is necessarily my position, but some people would argue are complicit in, or at least certainly have not put in adequate safety measures. So the openness dilemma is, how, or is it possible to release anything open source in a way that is safe and robust? And if not, and most people I talk to seem to think, well, the answer is you can't really guarantee that in those formats. How do we now think about open source in this day and age compared to its origins when the technology was much less sophisticated, the code that was being published, that is? And the area that I really think about in this context, David, is this idea that we're starting to see code interpreters and potentially moving from low code to no code for everyday people in terms of generating and then actually implementing. And so maybe this is my one speculative, kind of big speculative point, but I'm imagining a future where people can type in, can prompt and say, build me a tool drawing from these open source libraries that can achieve this, right? And in that world, that truly leads to some difficult situations. So I'm very sympathetic to open source. I understand for the academic communities, it's the bedrock of what they do. It's fostered a lot of progress. Most of the people using open source are good faith actors. It's a great place to drive curiosity, collaboration, and so on. At the same time, there are some big challenges, and I don't have that answer. If I did, as I said, I'd be a multi-billionaire. But I think this is going to be one of the real points of reckoning moving forward, particularly as we start to see deepfakes and malicious generative content increasingly present in day-to-day life, and some of those real smoking gun cases occur targeting politicians or big businesses and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's it. Huge questions. Certainly not ones that we're going to solve on this call. But Henry, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you as ever. I wish you all the best for your future work, and best of luck for everything that you do in the next coming months. Who knows where everything's going to lead, but one thing's for sure, we'll cover it all here on the AI Canvas. So join us next time where we're going to have more guests talking about generative AI and the impact on society. So Henry, just want to say thank you again.
Thanks so much, David.